This is like take 365. All right, sometimes it's just better to do the video in the car. So anyway, this video is, I want to talk about a really important tool for African American research that many people may not know about. And if you are stuck and you cannot get past a certain point with your ancestors, you may want to try the Civil War pension file. Okay, what does that mean? Well, it's what it sounds like, right? After the war, there were pensions. Some of the soldiers or their widows filed it, and in the file, which many of them are with the National Archives, some are with the VA, Veteran Affairs, the file has a lot of really robust information that you really can't get anywhere else. You're certainly not going to get it on a census record. Some of it is like straight from the ancestors, like mouth. So it's like, primary source. You can get information like a plantation that they lived on, or were enslaved on. You can get information about a first wife, or if you're fortunate, parents, like the parents' names, where they were born. Maybe if they know, because sometimes the enslaved did not really know when they were born, but you can get an approximate birth year or something that gets you a little closer. Employment, you can find out where your ancestor may have worked after the war. The names of children, you can verify stuff like that. It is such an important tool. For those who may not know, there's something called the 1870 brick wall that a lot of African Americans deal with. So for those of us who descend from the enslaved, 1870 is the first census record that we're listed by name. Prior to that, we were not listed as people, right? Our ancestors were listed as property. So you might get a slave schedule with the age and the sex of the individual, the enslaved, but there's no name on it. You might see in an estate record, the closest you might get to a name, or finding your ancestor in a historical record beyond that, sometimes might be an estate sale or something like that, where it lists, your ancestor by name along with property. It's frustrating. It can be really frustrating. I have my own brick walls as well. But fortunately for one ancestor, Larkin Woodruff, he was a Civil War veteran, and I was finally able to get a copy of his Civil War pension file. It took me a lot of running around, like a lot of back and forth. My friend went to DC to try and find it. She couldn't find it. DC sent me to like Missouri. Some paperwork I had to send to Missouri. Missouri was like, we don't have it. Then they sent me back to the VA, or they sent me to the VA. And then I decided to go physically to DC to also just double check. And it was just, it was not successful. That happened around 2022 or so, or 2021. And I had actually tried to apply maybe like 10 years ago. I came across, something in passing about the Civil War pension files. And at that point, I had confirmed that he was a Civil War veteran. So really, it was years in the making trying to find his Civil War pension file. And so I finally got it. It came in the mail in the fall, I want to say in October. 279 pages. And it is just so rich with information. In fact, my thumbnail, I will use this basically like a photo that I made that kind of like gives you bullet points of some of the things I found on the Civil War pension file. Really important tool. Even though I did find, I was looking for it years ago, I do like to give a shout out to Bernice Bennett. She's a dear friend. She's, well known in the Black genealogy space. You can certainly Google her. She's an author. She was one of the people who was really kind of like the rallying, putting forth the rallying cry for African Americans to really look at Civil War pension files. And honestly, as someone else stated, she's also someone who forces us to think about other alternative files that we don't think about in order to, learn about our ancestors and start piecing together the narrative and their stories and the history, beyond just looking at, you know, census records and, you know, maybe some property records and things like that. There's so many like different ways of learning about our ancestors and filling in those gaps. So a really important tool, very very rich, very robust. One of the ways in which I suggest people, it's not like a cheat tool, but if you don't know if your ancestor was in the Civil War, I'll take my ancestor for example. So we have a picture of him, and there was always this narrative about him being in the war, but I didn't hear Civil War. I actually had heard Spanish American War. That's what I was told. Now the years do kind of line up for Spanish American War. I'm not saying he didn't fight in the Spanish American War, but I haven't found any records suggesting so. However, I did eventually find his muster card on, I think it was Ancestry or Family Search, one of the two. I think it was Ancestry. And from there, the muster card gave me the regiment. And then that's when I knew, like, oh, okay, so he was in the Civil War. And so from there, I was able to do further research. So what you can do is, if you have ancestors, so the war, right, 1865, if you have an ancestor that was alive, a male ancestor, but even sometimes women, who was alive around 1865, who would have been of, you know, military age around about, you can check NPS, which is the National Park Service's website, and you can put in your ancestor's name. You want to account for variations, and you can see if, because they have a catalog, you can see if your ancestor was in the war. That's one way of doing it. Perfect example of spelling variations. Larkin, my ancestor, even though his file does come up under Larkin, there was a in parentheses Martin, right? So phonetically it can sound like Martin. So something to keep in mind. You can, I think you can divide it. You can do the search either by Union or Confederate. Most likely Union, but there were Black Confederate soldiers. That's a whole nother story. Many of them were not there voluntarily. There's a weird story about some who were, but that was I think that was down in Louisiana. That was an interesting thing. But there was a very interesting story, sidebar, about this Black man whose ancestor was listed as a Confederate soldier, and the white family that enslaved their ancestor was trying to make it like their narrative was like, well, he wanted to fight in the Confederate, you know, but it turned out through the research that, you know, he didn't have a choice, right? He was still property, and he was there, you know, in service to the enslaver. So it does happen. You want to check both Confederate and Union just to, like, you know, cross your T's, dot your I's, and all that. But Civil War pension files, really important tool. And yeah, also too, don't give up. That's the other thing I want to say is it's not always a cut and dry, you apply and then you get it. I know people who have applied years ago, they're still looking for it. Some people, they apply, they get it immediately. A lot of it depends on when the file was transferred to the National Archives. Some files are still in the custody of the VA. Then you have different facilities of the National Archives, like I mentioned, Missouri, you've got DC. And then obviously you have files that may have been lost. You could have files that have been refiled under another name. Other thing you can look at is, if you cannot find your ancestor, there's possibly a widow's pension file. So if you know of their spouse, and you know maybe they died around what could have been, it doesn't necessarily mean they died during the war, but if you know that they were married, you might want to also look at a widow's pension file. So for my ancestor, the very top of the file is the widow's pension file. So it's got information from my second great grandmother, Millie Woodruff. One of the really, like, probably one of the most beautiful things, there were two really awesome things that were in the file. One was, so Grandma Millie, the oral story of Grandma Millie that I've always heard, even though I've never met her, you know, she died before I was born. But she has a reputation in our family as being like, basically a woman who worked the land, right? She knew how to heal you based off of like working the land. Like, she could make stuff. She could cook anything, really like stretching all kinds of like foods and making pies and this and that. And I'm told she even made, what do you call it? What is that harsh liquor? Moonshine. So she was an alchemist in that way, right? Very much a healer. And in the file, there's a part where Larkin has an abscess, and the person interviewing him is taking a note of all the things, like, the veteran is mostly doing well, but he does have his abscess that hasn't quite healed yet. And then he talks about how Millie, he said, and the veteran's wife came and created like a poultice with like some soap and I forgot what else she used. She used like egg white or something like that to put it on the abscess to help it heal. So it's like Grandma Millie's like in the file doing what Grandma Millie does, So that was one really cool thing. The other really cool thing was Larkin's personality starts coming out in some of the file, where there's I think it was called the report of investigation. And the reporter's there just kind of checking in. Sometimes they would check in on the veterans either to assess a claim, to see if they were like, of good mental faculties, or if they had some senility they needed to look into, if they were being taken advantage of, all these things, And he says something that the reporter says to Larkin, and Larkin basically says, I want my roses from the government. I'm paraphrasing, but he does say roses. Like he's like, I want my flowers from the government. Make sure I get my roses down. Because he fought in the war. And so it was just to see him say that, to hear him say that, to read that was like so cool. I was like, yes, that's right, Larkin. Like, you better get your roses. Let them know. And it was, I'm seeing him, fight for a pension, fight for an increase, and just trying to survive after the war and make a life for himself and his family. And the pension check also is something that I grew up hearing about, because that's what helped raise some of my grandmother and her siblings, was that those pension checks. It made a difference. When Larkin died, that's how Millie, that's one of the ways, or the main ways, that Millie was able to provide for the family, because she did end up taking care of some of her grandchildren. So, it's a full circle moment, because even though it feels far away, it's still very like, it's still not, you know what I mean? Like my grandmother, my great aunt or grand aunt, they're still alive, and they remember Grandma Millie, and they remember those pension checks. There's my uncle, my great grand uncle Clarence is mentioned in the file. I remember Uncle Clarence. I've met Uncle Clarence. So it's just, it brings your ancestors to life in a way that, is just, you cannot, it can't be duplicated. You can't find this on census records. I see Grandma Millie struggle to prove that she was a lawful widow, which was crazy, because when Larkin was alive, he identified her several times as his wife. But when he passed away, she had to get all these affidavits from people who had to, say, Larkin's first wife died. I was there when she died. And I'm just like, to put her through that. And Millie at one point was written down as being illiterate. Like, she couldn't read and write. But she had to, like, get these affidavits and get this stuff together to prove that she was the lawful widow. One of the things that did come out of that struggle was an affidavit from her stepdaughter. So Josephine Hurley, who I had heard about, her nickname was Big Sis. That's how my granddaughter used to refer to her, Josephine Hurley. Heard stories about her making it big in Detroit, leaving Mississippi, going to Detroit. But one of the things is that she is in the affidavit to say, my mom, Annie, was his first wife, but she died when I was a baby. But she gives a name of a plantation in the affidavit, right? So it was called Sanders Plantation. So that's like a start for me. That's a place for me. That's a name I would not have otherwise gotten, right? Josephine Hurley is long deceased, and there's no reason for me to have known that. I've never heard it from any oral stories, but there it is right there in the file. Now, because of something else Larkin says in the file, he said he had 4 masters. So that tells me that Larkin was probably sold at least, maybe 4 times, right? So he probably didn't stay on the Sanders plantation. Other things I found, I've always associated this side of my family, this is my Woodruff line, with Mississippi. That's where I would go in the summers to see that side of the family. But thanks to the file, I know that he actually was in Louisiana. So I don't remember if he said he was born there. I think he did say that. But I know that there is a Louisiana connection there. He also references I guess it was a world event. I'm not sure where it was seen, but he says, he gives his age, and he's like, I'm over, I don't know if he says I'm over 100 years old, or he says something else, but he's like, just count it up for yourself, for I was, quote, a chunk of a little boy when the stars fell. And then there's a notation that says 1833, question mark. Someone was kind enough, they attended one of my presentations, they were kind enough to point out that 1833 was likely when there was a meteor storm in the United States. It may have been seen in other places. Like I said, I'm not sure. But sure enough, if you Google 1833 meteor storm, it comes up. And that's likely what Larkin was referencing. The stars fell. That's what it was, right? It was like you could see the stars falling from the sky. He says he didn't witness the event, but he remembers people like crying and stressing out about it like the next morning or so. So I learned like a whole new bit of history, right? And I had always heard that Larkin was really old, right? The census records give him so many different varying birth years. But for him to have already been a child in 1833 is like, man, like, he was old. So I thought that means by 1865 he was already like in his 30s or so, or close to it. And he would have been in his 30s, because if he's a chunk of a little boy in 1833, he was born before 1833. So I had always heard that he was super old, but the census records were never quite clear on that. But he's saying he witnessed he was around when the stars fell. And I'm like, if he really wanted to like exaggerate, he would have just said, oh yeah, I saw them and everything. But he says, no, I didn't see them, but I remember the next day everybody was going like nuts. So I'm like, wow. So he may have even been born like the late 1820s. So I mean, fascinating stuff. Another really interesting point, and I'll wrap this up because I don't want this video to be too long, is in the picture that we have of Larkin, he always had like an arm, one of his arms looked really limp. I think it's like his left arm or so, or whatever, or maybe it's the right arm, I don't remember. It looked limp, but I couldn't really tell what was going on. In the file, I learned that he worked at like JCRR Railroad, but basically he did have an accident on the job. He was coupling car trains, so I'm assuming putting them together, linking them together, and his legs gave way and his arm got crushed by the train car. So that's a whole new bit of information. So I have an employer, I have the story about his injury, an associate, like a friend, who also gave like a statement on his behalf, basically to validate his claim for disability by basically saying like, Larkin was not a drunk or a drug addict. It's not like he was at work high or whatever, or drunk. He was in fact like an upstanding person. He was sober, so you can bet that it was like his legs did actually give way, that he's telling the truth. So I mean, I can go on and on. Like I said, 279 pages. I've gone through it all There's a lot of things where the handwriting is not clear at all. Like, there is terrible handwriting in there, which is annoying because I'm like, ooh, what does that say? But really encourage people who are doing African American research, really try to get your hands on a Civil War pension file. If you have an ancestor that you know was in the Civil War, certainly do your best to see if you can get that file. Be patient with yourself, be patient with National Archives, but be persistent, you know. And so that's that on that. All right, y'all, I'll see you later. Thanks for listening. Stay curious.